Amnon Weinstein's earliest memories are of his immediate family sitting around the table at major Jewish holidays like Rosh Hashanah and Passover in the late 1940s. There were 4 of them: Amnon, his little sister Esther, and their parents, Moshe and Golda. And 400 ghosts. These were the ghosts of the relatives who had been left behind when Moshe and Golda had immigrated to Palestine in 1938. Moshe was a violinist and a violin teacher. Knowing that he would not be able to make a living as a violinist in Palestine, Moshe decided to become a violin repairman. The violin is a very popular instrument in Jewish culture, and Moshe wisely predicted that the tens of thousands of Jews who were immigrating to Palestine would create a market for an outstanding craftsman who could fix their instruments. In order to develop his skills, Moshe traveled to Warsaw to apprentice with Yaakov Zimmerman, a respected Jewish violin maker. Zimmerman is remembered as an outstanding artisan who was also very kind, especially toward young Jewish musicians. Famous violinist Ida Handel, who was 7 years old when her father brought her to Warsaw to study at the Chopin Conservatory, described Zimmerman as a selfless person who would often repair instruments for free. Former concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic Michel Schwalbe, who also trained in Warsaw, recalled how Zimmerman gave him everything he needed to play the violin, including instruments, strings, and bow hairs. Zimmerman even found a room in the apartment of Warsaw industrialist Szymon Krongold, in which Schwalbe could practice. For Jewish children like Handel and Schwalbe, this level of support was life-changing. Zimmerman disappeared during the Holocaust. It is presumed he died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Moshe opened his violin shop after moving to Palestine and quickly established himself as a prominent figure in Tel Aviv's burgeoning music scene. He was a peaceful man who thought that all children should learn to play the violin. People who played music, he believed, could be neither evil nor violent. While the exploitation of music during the Holocaust would prove him wrong, Moshe himself exemplified the noble principles behind his convictions by arranging scholarships that helped promising young talents like Pinchas Zugerman and Shlomo Mintz travel to the United States to receive the best training in the world. By the end of the Holocaust, Moshe and Golda had heard very little from the relatives they had left behind. At first, they had received a few letters asking for help with securing visas from family members who had hoped to join them in Palestine. But all communication had stopped once Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Then, a Holocaust survivor visited Moshe in Tel Aviv and told him how his entire family had been killed. The horrific stories were too much for Moshe to handle. That night, he suffered the first of many heart attacks that would ultimately cause his death. Moshe never spoke of his family again. It was just as hard for Golda to talk about her family. They had remained behind in Vilna, which was occupied by the German army on June 22, 1941. The troops were quickly followed by death squads that began rounding up Jews and taking them to the nearby Ponari forest. Ponari had once been a popular weekend getaway for Vilna's Jews and Gentiles alike. Now it would become the site of one of the most brutal massacres in the Holocaust. There were 57,000 Jews living in Vilna during the German invasion. By the time the Red Army liberated the city on July 13, 1944, only a few thousand survived. Like Moshe, none of Golda's relatives survived. Racked with survivor's guilt, Golda threw away the letter she had received from her family. The memories were like voices she could no longer bear to hear. When young Amnon would ask about his grandparents, aunts, and uncles, she would struggle to find words that could explain why he would never be able to meet them. The best she could do was bring out a book she had found about the Vilna Ghetto and the Ponari massacre. "This is where your grandparents are," she would tell him, pointing to the ghastly photos of the dead. "This is my family." She would break down in tears, unable to explain further. Although they could never bring themselves to discuss their dead relatives, the guilt and sorrow Moshe and Golda felt over their devastating losses permeated the Weinstein household, and with it, Amnon's childhood. They were tangible reminders as well. The Weinstein apartment was the first stop in Palestine for survivors from Vilna who were hoping to start a new life in the land of their biblical ancestors. Moshe welcomed them all into his apartment for homemade meals and warm beds until they could find homes of their own. Young Amnon was frightened by the emaciated guests who were startled by every noise. He could not understand why they had leftover bread under their pillows and blankets. Years passed until the sounds of the visitors crying themselves to sleep stopped resonating in his own nightmares. As a young man, Amnon tried to forget about the catastrophe that had robbed him of his extended family and replaced them with terrifying strangers. He busied himself with establishing a career as a luthier, a maker and repairer of string instruments. Growing up in his father's violin shop, Amnon had watched as Moshe had helped countless young violinists launch their performing careers. Moshe had given the poorest students violins, bows, and strings, just as his mentor, Yaakov Zimmerman, had done for Jewish children in Warsaw. Amnon wanted to make the same impact on the lives of musicians. When Moshe passed away in 1986, Amnon took over the family business. In 1998, he continued the dynasty that his father had initiated by starting to train his own son, Avshalom, who may be the first third-generation Jewish luthier in history. By that time, Amnon had established himself as one of the finest luthiers in the world and an important figure in Israeli culture. Despite Amnon's efforts to ignore the Holocaust, it continued to haunt him. In the late 1980s, a man who had played the violin in Auschwitz visited Amnon's workshop. The survivor had not touched his instrument since leaving the death camp. He now wanted to get it restored for his grandson. The top of the violin was damaged from having been played in the rain and the snow. When Amnon took the instrument apart, he discovered ashes inside that he could only assume to be fallout from the crematoria at Auschwitz. The very thought of what that violin and its owner had been through together shook Amnon to his core, but he quickly pushed those gruesome thoughts aside. It was still too difficult for him to think about the Holocaust. By the 1990s, around the same time he started training his son Avshalom, Amnon was finally ready to reclaim his lost heritage. 5 decades after his family had been destroyed, he started reflecting not only on the Holocaust, but on the role that music, specifically the violin, had played in Jewish lives throughout that dark period. He began locating and restoring violins that were played by Jewish musicians during the Holocaust. Some of the instruments that Amnon has tracked down were damaged during the Holocaust and had been unplayable ever since. But once he brings them into his workshop, Amnon pours his heart, his soul, and his considerable expertise as a master luthier into breathing new life into them. The painstaking restorations can take up to 18 months. When Amnon is done piecing the violins back together, they are ready for performances in the world's finest concert halls. Although some of the musicians who once played the neglected and severely damaged instruments were silenced by the Holocaust, their voices and spirits live on through the violins that Amnon has lovingly restored. He calls these instruments the Violins of Hope.